Welcome everybody to Philosophy Slam, the podcast, not the musical, at least not yet, Mark, although at some point you never know. With, Mark Vernon. Hello, Mark.
Hi there. You say not the musical yet, but do you remember we did that gig once in the comedy club at the invitation of Pippa Evans, who's a brilliant comedian, but also improvises musicals. And I think we'd like nothing better than to have what we're going to do sort of presented to her. And she would riff with it in a wonderful way. I have absolutely no doubt about it. But maybe you should tell people what we're about to do first.
And me, Robert Rowland Smith. Yes, I will. That's absolutely right. We did appear a couple of times at Camden Comedy Club a few years ago. We were both terrified, at least I know I was, because, after half an hour or so of comedy, the audience was obviously expecting to laugh. Then we come on, complete downer for everybody. But anyway, Philosophy Slam, whether live or online, as it is today, is an exercise in improvisation, as Mark just said, where we take random words, either taken off the internet through a random word generator, which we're going to do today, or thrown at us by the audiences who come and see us live, usually in members clubs and so on in London, but sometimes other places. And we take a word or two and we speak about each of them from a psychological, philosophical, historical, and so on perspective. And then we try and make links, if we can, between the two. And today, Mark, we have two words we both immediately liked. The first one is plagiarise, and the other one is root, R-O-O-T. So for an American audience, root, not R-O-U-T-E, which you might pronounce as route. This is root. Now, plagiarise is a verb always. Root, generally speaking, is a noun, but can be a verb to root around, for example. And I noticed you sort of salivating in anticipation, Mark, when we got both of these words. So I think you've already got something to ruminate with.
Yeah, thank you. Wonderful words. I mean, just to say, these random word generators, maybe it's something about words. There's never really a random word. There's always some sort of link. But that's another theme, perhaps, for another day. But immediately, the word plagiarise particularly sparked one of my keen interests around words, which is how words will both change meaning across the course of time, but also appear at particular moments in time. And I happen to have written about the word plagiarise at some point, and particularly about its origins, which are in the beginning of the Christian period. So like the first and second centuries of the new switch from the Common Era, from before the Common Era into the Common Era. And so it's very fascinating to ask why plagiarism, to plagiarise, starts to become a concern at that point. And broadly speaking, the story that I was trying to tell is that the notion of plagiarise or plagiarism rests on the idea that there's an individual author, that someone has penned these words, has produced this image, has written this poem or song, and that somehow that creation therefore belongs to them. And so to either rip off, as you might say now, that creation and call it your own, or indeed to use the great creative's name and claim that they wrote or penned it when really it was you. And these forms of plagiarism start to become questions in particularly, I think, the 2nd century CE. And the reason why they start to become a question is because before that time, there had been this tradition of writing or producing texts, particularly the kind of scripture that would claim some sort of inspiration, and linking it to an original author that was seen as the original source of the inspiration. So, for example, take Plato. It's generally reckoned that there's 30 or more dialogues that are originally by Plato, but there's been a cluster of between 5 and 10 other ones that were thought to be by Plato, but now are reckoned to have been written by maybe followers of Plato or in the school of Plato. And that work to differentiate between the ones that belong to Plato as an individual rather than the penumbra of Plato, is precisely one of the concerns that starts to emerge with this notion of plagiarism. And I think what's happening there is that rather than, as I think probably was the case with Plato at the time, actually, but certainly in the period after Plato, through the Hellenistic period into the Neoplatonic period, where you would have felt yourself to have belonged to this wider tradition. And so saying something you wrote was by Plato was an expression of that. It wasn't a sort of lie or a con. It wasn't an effort in plagiarism. It was actually in a way, it was an acknowledgement of the tradition, the spirit that you felt to be part of. That starts to get questioned when there's this keener sense of the individual person emerging. But I think this is a whole other story, but I think it's very connected to this emergence of Christianity and the sense of personhood as we are inclined to think of it now. But it brings up, there's these other sort of wider questions like plagiarism. And just to link in the notion of root before handing back to you, you might say that whereas before people were rooted in some sort of collected tradition that they would write from, now we feel we're rooted in something that is more individual, that belongs to us as a person. And so therefore notions like plagiarism and others, rights or freedom, there's a whole range of issues that get reframed because of this shift. But plagiarism and how we're rooted would be one of them.
Yeah, absolutely wonderful, Mark. And I didn't know that at all about Plato and some of the origins there. I mean, one of the links for me between these two words, root and plagiarize, is around the notion of copyright, which you're sort of hinting at in those early discussions, really, and the notion of the author, because whatever the author is, they're not just the person who's written the work, they're the person who owns the work as well. And there's author sort of contains both those ideas, but not fully. And I may have this wrong, but I think copyright is an 18th century invention, which has been further developed, partly to do with the deregulation, really, of publication that, starting, there's big pamphlet culture in the 17th century, certainly in this country. But then this question with the proliferation of privately printed text, who's written this thing, who owns it, and indeed whose ideas are they? And so there's plagiarizing in the sense there of going back to the root, the original, the author there, who owns this stuff? Can we track it back to the beginning? As if there is a single origin there, and as if language itself could be fully owned by somebody. Now, here I'm thinking, as you know, I'm very keen on this French philosopher Jacques Derrida, who's written about copyright. And one of the things he says is that, you only need a concept of copyright if there's a danger, to use one of our previous philosophy slam words, that the text itself can be appropriated by somebody else. If you can just assert authorship and that's the end of the story, there'd be no issue with copyright. You could just say, I, Mark, wrote this book on William Blake called Awake. That's the end of the story. But Derrida points out, well, you only need copyright in the first place because there's something about language which is appropriable or stealable or plagiarizable. So the root can be deracinated, can be torn up, divided, shared, and so on. And he says, actually, this is the property of all language. Whether I quote a whole chunk of your book, Mark, a whole chapter and pass it off as mine, or a sentence or a word, Derrida says, well, all language is quotable. And because it's quotable, our attempts at mastering it through authorship, ownership, copyright, in order to see off plagiarism, can only ever be limited. Or rather, you can only have a legalistic way of trying to contain it. You can't have an essential way of containing it because language is just not containable in that way. So language will always drift from its root, or rather, the root, as in the ownership and authorship of a particular work of art, is already in principle divided right from the start. Because as soon as you produce a word or write a word, you're in a sense already quoting. It's quotable in its very origin. So the root for Derrida is a concept really of pathos and fantasy, because root is never singular in that way. It's already divided.
And these are very, very live kind of issues. When you were talking there, it made me think about AI, and is an artificial intelligence, particularly in the form of a large language model, essentially a very, very sophisticated form of plagiarism, because, of course, what it's doing is it's taking a huge, vast database of that which has been previously written and using the patterns, the statistical analysis, the algorithmic production of new words, but drawing entirely on the old words. You know, a data center is like a vast library or a vast memory bank. Now, the technology is very, very impressive, the speed of it, for one thing, but also the way that it can scale and the way that it can pass off a seeming intelligence behind that. But of course, the root of the AI's plagiarism is not intelligence, or at least it's only intelligence one step removed. The intelligence rests, with the human creators of the technology, but is something, I think, much more mechanical. And the reason why that which is mechanical develops the appearance of the kind of fluidity that you or I would use, we hope, when we speak, when we write. And so sort of talk of a rootedness. Just noting what you're saying there about Derrida, maybe the rootedness is not in ourself, and that's what Derrida is calling to question, but is more dispersed again. Maybe it's a strange return to this older sense that I was alluding to before concerns about plagiarism emerged, where somehow language itself is seen to be active, to contain a kind of intelligence that we collaborate with, to use a word coined by J.R.R. Tolkien, and there's someone that you talk about very regularly. Tolkien talked about this notion of co-creativity. It's like that which is in the language and that which was within us, we can work together in order to produce new creative output and so on. But that's very different. That's a very different kind of rootedness that might, it's interesting comparing language itself with a large language model, and asking, what makes, when we're speaking, not plagiarism, whereas when the AI produces a response to our prompt, a form of plagiarism.
So interesting. This word root, we're actually talking about it so far in a somewhat metaphorical way. We're not talking about root as in trees or plants and so on. And something you said there made me think of the fact of roots and plagiarism being connected in the world of gardening. Now, bear with me on this because it sounds like a bit of a stretch. I moved to the country, as you know, about a year ago, and the house that I live in now has raised beds for growing vegetables. And last year I planted some garlic in November, and I've harvested it this year. And it's not brilliant, but it's fine. And my neighbour said, well, you should plant the same. So take a bulb of garlic that you've grown, take one of the cloves and plant it again. Then you'll have another lot next year. And he says, actually, when you do that, the garlic improves. But anyway, it struck me that, and obviously I'm no gardener here or botanist or whatever, but when we are producing plants out of plants, more garlic out of another garlic, we are taking the root, the bulb, and we're making a copy, in a certain sense, from the previous generation. It's plagiarism in a generational sense. And that's, it seems to me, the whole of propagation, in a way. You're taking a root and multiplying it in a way that is a facsimile, more or less, of what had preceded it. So is my new garlic crop going to be a copy of the first garlic crop or not? I know Derrida uses the word iteration when he talks about plagiarism, but he's keen to point out that the word iteration comes from a Sanskrit word, which means other. So when you repeat something, it's the same and other at the same time. So if I do plant a next generation of garlic, in what sense is that is the root being plagiarized, copied? In what sense is it new? In what sense are, anybody from a second generation, if you think about your parents or my parents, am I a plagiarized version? Generally, I know this is a weird thought, but plagiarism is about copying, right? And I mean, I used to teach undergraduate students in Oxford, and very rarely students would plagiarize, but they would do it in such a way as to add one or two sentences of their own. So it wasn't a perfect copy. And we know in the pre-AI age, students were doing this as well. They'd copy and paste loads of stuff, but just put in a few words of their own here and there sprinkled in to stop their professors copying and pasting that in turn and doing a search on the internet to see if it'd been pasted. So there's a few ideas in there, isn't there? There's generations, there's copy, what's a perfect copy, and so on, and how far from the root do you deviate before it becomes a new thing in its own right? Apologies for the slight tenuous connection.
Well, no, let me try and spin to even more overtly an esoteric form here, actually, because when you were talking about the garlic and is it a copy, and nonetheless, your neighbour recommended doing it because the crop next year would be better, and this made me think actually of the figure Owen Barfield, who I don't think I quite name-checked before, but it was because of Barfield that I got onto this idea about the way that words change meaning and the significance of them appearing at certain points in history and so on. And Barfield himself was very influenced by an overtly esoteric figure called Rudolf Steiner, the founder of anthroposophy. Now, Steiner is certainly a whole subject unto itself, but one of the key ideas I think Steiner illuminates rather interestingly in relation to what we're saying today is he differentiates between what he calls substitution, continuity, and transformation. And for him, we human beings are very inclined either to go for a substitution or a continuity, but we're rather wary of transformation. So continuity is the kind of conservative mentality when it gets rather literal. Everything must stay the same, nothing must change. It's dangerous, to loop back to the other word that we had previously, when something breaks the continuity. But then substitution is the more revolutionary impulse, which is, no, everything is wrong. We must rip it up from the root and replace it with something new. That too, though, brings its own kind of dislocation and a sort of deadening effect, even amidst the sort of energy of the hopeful moment of revolution. But what Barfield and I think Steiner said, no, the real spirit of what it is to be human is to try and focus on transformation. So transformation is kind of a mix of continuity, but with discontinuity. And it's also a mix of preserving something, but also in a new manifestation. So a kind of substitution as well, but it doesn't rip up from the root, but does, as it were, regrow something from a root that already exists and so has that sort of deep reach into the soil. And so I'm sort of slipping back into the metaphorical use of these terms again now, but maybe, the garlic itself is an example of that actually the next generation of your garlic crop won't be a substitution. It won't be just like a completely new garlic plant because it has a relationship to the old one, but neither will it be a pure continuity. And because the new garlic, if your neighbour's right, will be improved, I guess because the organism in some way will be better able to respond to the particularities of your raised beds. So I like this idea that in between the kind of plagiarism, which is just replication under a different name, there is the possibility of a transformation that is sort of, I don't know, draws on the root, but produces something that's distinctly different as well. How about that, Rowland?
I love it. I absolutely love it. And actually, it reminds me that maybe this is a final thought for today. I've been reading this book that you gave me years ago, Mark, which is a study of Rudolf Steiner by A.J. Shepard. And I've been nearly finished it, and I have been thinking throughout, gosh, there's an awful lot of Hegel in Steiner. Now, I haven't read enough Steiner yet to know whether Steiner name checks Hegel or not. And of course, we think of them as being completely different. We think of Steiner anthroposophy, esoteric, very strange work. We think of Hegel not as easy, but an established figure in the philosophical tradition. And the idea of actually combining or comparing and contrasting these two, I think, would be pretty weird to most, certainly to any philosophers, in their more orthodox tradition. If they asked you to write an essay comparing Steiner and Hegel, I think they'd be very unusual. But there are two reasons for mentioning that. I think Steiner's notion of transformation, which is keeping something of what's preceded and then transforming it, improving it, expanding it, and so on. I think that relates directly to Hegel's notion of the Aufhebung, which is the dialectical process. Basically, you take what's gone before, you don't reject it, you just evolve it in some way. And in a way, that's the relationship between Steiner and Hegel itself. Steiner isn't plagiarizing Hegel. There are all sorts of echoes there. Hegel might be the root in many ways. Of course, he has his own roots, but Hegel might be the root, which I think then Steiner is obviously not plagiarizing, but transforming in some way. And I think you're right. In a way, this is like good plagiarism. There's bad plagiarism, which is just a sort of empty copy. And there's sort of good plagiarism, which works it, which reminds me of that wonderful T.S. Eliot quote, immature poets imitate, mature poets steal.
Well, look, on that provocative, but nonetheless, I hope stimulating, transformative thought even, let's draw to a close there. I hope you've enjoyed listening to these reflections today on plagiarism and, what was the other one?
Root and plagiarize.
Oh, yes, root. For some reason, I became
detached from your root.
Really deracinated momentarily. Look, if you've enjoyed this, then do follow us on YouTube and elsewhere if you've been listening elsewhere. Join us again when we will bring two words together. It's amazing how even a random word generator seems to convey some kind of meaning, which our active imaginations can try and tease apart, sometimes convincingly, sometimes with more of a playfulness, shall we say. But also, we do appear in person doing the Philosophy Slam, not just Philosophy Slam, the podcast. So check out our website for that. And we are indeed available for bookings too. So, Robert, thanks so much for another wonderful 20 minutes.
Thank you, Mark.